So when you're reading, I always tell people to pray, ask for the meaning to be revealed, because what you'll notice if you really dive into reading the Bible, is, and I was really thrilled, Alice left a nice comment last time saying it's coming alive for her as we go in here and dig into it. So that's a blessing to me. But honestly, ask for meaning to be revealed, because there's so much depth that if when the first time I read the scriptures as compared to now that I pray and ask for revelation, it's just night and day what comes alive for you when you really dig into the depth of what is there. And then when you're reading, ask, what does this mean? Because there's going to be several things I'm going to point out in today's chapters that are going to demonstrate the importance of this. Because, a lot of people, what we tend to do is we tend to skip over things we don't understand. We just do it almost naturally. But really what's going to give you some really greater depth of understanding is simply to stop when you don't understand something. And I'm going to encourage you to raise your hand and make that point today while we're going through this. Is, I don't understand what that means, because we skip it over. This is almost like what we do naturally. And that's one of the reasons I also talk about, I truly believe asking questions is a spiritual discipline, because a lot of people don't ask questions because they don't want to feel stupid or they don't want to feel silly. But if you don't, then you don't get to revelation. This is what, I shared out of Matthew 13, is Jesus is giving the parable of the seeds, and everybody's listening to him give this. And he taught it designed in a way so nobody would understand it. It's called parables. So you would hear but not understand. And everybody's sitting there listening, going, yeah, that's pretty good, I think. I'm not going to let anybody know I don't understand it. But then the disciples went to him afterwards, because they're in a relationship with him, and said, hey, boss, help me understand. What does that mean? And then this is what he said to him. He said, it has been granted to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom. Why? Because they asked the questions. It's as simple as that. People think it's some basic thing to get you through. Just ask. So raise your hand, and there's the little emoticon things at the bottom. You raise your hand, I'll give the big giant yellow hand up, and then I'll stop and we'll answer whatever questions you have. All right. Also, when you ask, one of the things that's really helpful is to ask, what does this mean for the original reader? Because what we need to do before we try to extrapolate how it applies to us today, it's really important to understand what was being said and why was it being said to people reading it when it was originally written. That is really important, because sometimes we try to make everything fit our worldview when really there's a completely different culture at work. And so it's important to ask that question. And then lastly, number 4, a lot of people ask me, what translations do I recommend? These are my top 4. And the first 3 are my top 3. There's other ones that are decent. There's other ones I'd strongly encourage you not to go to, but the New American Standard Bible is my favorite. It's not perfect, but it's my best study Bible. The English Standard Version is good. It's the one I'm using for this. And then New King James Version is far different than King James Version. I'm going to give a funny example about that today. And then a New International Version is another option. And then here's a couple questions I'm going to answer for people. So the first question is, why do you think reading the Bible is so important? And it's out of Romans 10. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the words of Christ. One of the things I teach people is I try to teach them how to hear the voice of God. But in order to hear the voice of God, you have to know the character and the heart of God. So the more I read, the more I understand that. And so then I can trust what I'm hearing, because it's consistent to how he's expressed himself in the scripture. So that's the number one aspect. But also it builds faith. By hearing the words of Christ, I can now trust that I'm hearing with faith. And then second question, I am reading the book of Acts. I'd love to understand more about the shift from the Jews to Gentiles as I continue to read Paul's journey. Here's what's interesting about this, because you'll get a different answer from a lot of Christians, but I'm really putting my foot down hard on this. There really wasn't a massive change from the Jewish expression to the church. If you look at this, this is what it says in Ephesians 2, verse 17. And he came and he preached peace to you who were afar off, because he was speaking to the Ephesians, and there was a lot more Gentiles over there, and peace to those who were near, which is the Jewish people. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. So really, the one new man that is spoken of in Ephesians 2 is the church. And the church is this full expression of those who are Jewish and have found Jesus as their Messiah, and those who are Gentiles who have found Jesus as their Messiah. So all it is everybody sees him as their Messiah. That is the church. So it doesn't change. Like somebody asked me, I'm Jewish. Do I need to change my beliefs in order to be a Christian? Outside of the Messiahship, no. You can do everything you want to do as far as enjoy different aspects of the traditions you learn as a Jewish person, and just know that Jesus was your Messiah. That's really the difference. There's a lot more depth we can go into there, but I hope that helps. There isn't a massive shift. It's really instead of considering it a shift, I consider it the doors opening wide. So now not only the Jew, but the Gentile, and Gentiles, anybody who's not a Jew, if you ever wondered. So the Jews and the rest of the world have now been opened to the gift of what God has given us. So I hope that's helpful. If that gives clarity. Any questions that have risen up just from what I just shared? Okay. All right. Last question. Hold on. The last point I'm going to do is show you something, because we've been going through the Gospel of John since April, and we're coming into John chapter 11 today. And I'm just showing you, this is a timeline I broke down, because what I do when I study a book is I will read it 3 times. I'll read the whole thing in one sitting, and then I'll read it chapter by chapter, and then I'll read it line by line. And in looking at that, you kind of get the big picture. And what's interesting about John is there's 21 chapters in John. So we're pretty much right dead center of the book right now. And so what you'll notice is the first 11 chapters were his everyday ministry. But now, starting 11 and especially in 12, we are now really focusing on the last 8 days of his life. Well, especially in John 12. We're getting near there. What the timeline is, what we're going to be doing here is, it was about April. It was during the time of Passover where he's crucified. This is showing that it's this discussion in John 11's somewhere between January and April. And the reason is, we just saw in the previous chapter, the Feast of Dedication had just taken place. That's Hanukkah, and Jesus, celebrated Hanukkah. And so this is after that. So we're going to be moving into January, February, somewhere before the Passion that we see in the Passover, which would have been in March or April, depending on the calendar year of that time. So the vast majority of his time in the book of John is given to the crucifixion, the trial, at every aspect of that. And that's one of the reasons why we choose this as the first book for people to study, is because it really goes in a lot of detail on every aspect of their faith. So now what I'm going to do is we are going to, hi, Anlita, just saw you show up. Good to see you. All right, so we're going to move into, good to see you. I'm going to open up my handy dandy So let me get rid of this. And just to let you know, this is called BibleGateway.com. Great study tool, and it's completely free. So that's why I use it. I got other Bible study tools and stuff, but this is an excellent one. And you don't have to spend a dime. Just go to BibleGateway.com and you can use it. And they didn't pay me anything to tell you this. I'm just kind of giving you tools to help you read the Bible. All right. So here we go. As we're starting in chapter 11 of John. And we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Lazarus when Jesus raised him from the dead. There's a few thoughts I want to do to kind of paint the picture for you before we really dive in. First of all, he is going to Bethany because that's where Lazarus is from. That's where he's going to eventually land. Just so you have perspective of where Bethany is. This is where Jesus would spend the night whenever he was going to come and minister and serve in Jerusalem. You know, he had a home in Capernaum, you know, which is where Peter was from. So he'd live there whenever they were near there. But whenever he was near Jerusalem, he stayed with Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, and Bethany. So if you're standing on the Mount of Olives, which is directly across from the Temple Mount, if you do a 180 and turn around, and I've done this, and it's a beautiful thing to do. So I'm standing on the Mount of Olives. This is probably about, I don't know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Time flies. But anyway, you turn around about 180 degrees. You're going to be looking down the Jordan Valley toward the Dead Sea. But right over the ridge there, about a mile and a half, 2 miles from Jerusalem proper, is this little town called Bethany. And it's on the east side. And that's where Lazarus was from, and he was sick. Now, we're going to read about the fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead here in a little bit. But here's a couple of things I want you to kind of recognize on why this is such a significant one. And one of these is kind of interesting, a tradition that came out of the Jewish traditions of that time. But Jesus had already raised the dead. Lazarus wasn't the first one he raised up Jairus's daughter, who had just died. And he said, oh, she didn't die, she's only sleeping. And he brought her back to life. But that was raising somebody from the dead. He did the same with the widow. But here's the thing that's interesting. Jewish traditions bury the dead the same day because they don't embalm. And what's interesting, if you go look at pictures of Mount of Olives, because what you may not have known is Mount of Olives is a giant graveyard. And a lot of that was because of some of the stories later on in the Gospels of, you know, him raising the dead and them all rising up. So they want to be on Mount of Olives because that's where he ascended. But Mount of Olives, in the Jewish tradition, death is an unclean thing. So you go to a cemetery in the United States, and they're just lush, beautiful lawns, and everything's manicured beautifully. They're desolate wastelands in Israel. There's nothing that grows there. They're rocks, and people's names, they're not highlighted. It's like this unclean. We don't go there. We stay away from it. It's just a sterile, just white rock everywhere. And so this is something that is something people don't realize is when you bury the dead, you treat them with spices, you did all this, but but after that, you didn't go hang out there much more. If you did, you'd put piles of rocks on top of where they're buried. But it's basically a place you stay away from because it's unclean. And dealing with death is unclean. The other thing that is kind of interesting about this story, though, because he's already raised many from the dead, but there was a massive tradition in the Jewish culture at that time. It wasn't in the law or in the Torah or anything like that, but a tradition or a myth they had was they would bury him the same day. But there was this thought that the spirit of that person would linger for 3 days. And so if they were still buried longer than 3 days, then there was no way they could come back. Lazarus was raised from the dead after 4 days. And I think that's one of the reasons that happened. So he had been dead for 4 days. And I actually had the privilege of meeting a gentleman named Luis, who was raised from the dead in Mexico. He was an orphan. Well, actually, he was discarded. He was thrown in a garbage dumpster in Paraguay. And this missionary couple rescued the baby out of the dumpster. And then they adopted it as their own child. And then when he was like about 9 or 10 years old, he collapsed from heart failure on a beach in Mexico and had been dead for over 3 hours. And then he was raised from the dead. And then he shared with me the stories of what he went through. Is pretty amazing. And so this whole thing of resurrection is a powerful thing to go through. But now let's start with the text. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, and whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man or Son of God may be glorified through it. So let's go back to this thing in verse 3. They're saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And this is a pattern that John uses a lot in the Gospels. He calls himself the one whom the Lord loved. That's how he called himself. And so they're saying, the one whom you love is sick, with Lazarus. What's interesting here is the word love that they're saying here is the word phileo, which means friend. There's 3 kinds of love you usually see with the Hebrew scriptures. Is phileo, which is friendship love. Then you have eros, which is sensual love. And then you have agape, which is unconditional love. And so it says the first one, Lord, whom you love, phileo, is sick. They were making an appeal to Jesus to create urgency due to his close relationship. They sent a messenger for him to come quickly in order to help Lazarus. That's the same language in John used. He called himself the one whom Jesus loved. This also addresses a false teaching just by bringing this up, because Jesus did love Lazarus. He was highly favored in his eyes, yet Lazarus still was sick and died. So this mindset that, there's something wrong in your relationship with God if you get sick and don't recover is something that this puts to bed. He's caused a lot of us to suffer and go through things while we're highly favored. So if you ever wrestle with that of feeling like, well, I must be doing something wrong if I'm sick, no, not necessarily. This is really about what God wants to do to glorify through your life. Now, let's go to verse 4. It says, Jesus said, the illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This is similar to what he said to the blind man in John 9, because in John 9, which we won't go back to there, they asked this question, is it because of the sin of his parents or because of his sin that he's blind? And God said, neither. He's blind in order for us to glorify God, and then he healed him. And so again, it's that thing of thinking it's our fault if we're sick, and as we can put that thing to bed. But then it said earlier, the one whom you love, phileo, is sick. Then in verse 5, it says, now Jesus loved. But then the word for love there is agape, unconditional, unrequited love that cannot be destroyed. His commitment. It said that Jesus loved, agape, Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So from their perspective, they didn't understand the depth of his love. He loved us. We're really good friends, but he had a deeper love that he now is, projecting there, where he loves these people deeply. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, verse 6, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Where he was, by the way, was he was down by the Dead Sea. That's where he started his ministry. That is where John the Baptist baptized him and said, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." That's what the Father said. And they were there because the earthly ministry was about to end, and they're about to go into the persecution that was going to happen during Passover. So this is like the beginning and the end of his earthly ministry, of me going out and about and doing that, has now ended. It was also a little warmer there. And they were trying to kill him in Jerusalem. So they were kind of staying away from Jerusalem until the right time. But what's fascinating is these people he deeply loved requested for him to come immediately. And he stayed down at the Dead Sea for 2 more days. Wait a minute. If you really loved them, you would go surrender and help them right now, wouldn't you? Obedience is a big deal. This was a close friend, and Jesus heard he was dying. He stayed away 2 more days. Then after that, he went into Judea, Jerusalem, instead of Bethany. Why? Because what he said earlier on, he said, "I only do what I see my Father doing." And what his Father showed him is, "I got a certain time for you to go visit Lazarus." He understood the timing of the Father, and it was to glorify the Son. Because he loved Lazarus, he delayed his coming. How many times have we felt like we asked God to do something and it was delayed? I had a time when I was in a very difficult situation where I had some church leaders that were trying to really throw me under the bus, so to speak, and were saying false accusations and things that were very hard to endure. But I very clearly heard the Lord tell me, "I'll be your defense. Don't defend yourself. Don't try to fix this." So I didn't. And I'll tell you what, I sure didn't feel like he defended me. I felt like I was left there under the bus. But about 2 years later, it all made more sense to me. I was asking God to protect me and to save my reputation in a dysfunctional environment, when what God wanted to do is get me out of that dysfunctional environment. And so if he had answered my prayer the way I wanted it done, I would have stayed in this dysfunctional environment instead of being put in a place where I could thrive in what he's called me to do. And that is something that we've got to understand, is if we feel like God hasn't answered our prayer, it's because he's doing something for our good. So that he is delaying many times, what it feels like delaying, because he's actually wanting to give us the best version of the situation he has for us. So he stayed away for 2 more days. Then after this, verse 7, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea," or Jerusalem again. Go back to Jerusalem instead of going to Bethany, delaying it even longer. Remember, when he got to them, it had been 4 days. And so he'd stayed there 2 days longer. Then he went back to Jerusalem because he planned on Lazarus dying. Martha is going to get angry with this. We tend to interpret the love of God through our circumstances rather than interpreting our circumstances through the love of God. And so he wasn't doing it the way she wanted to, so she was going to be angry because these circumstances are going to prove to me that he loves. No, he loves. And now we're going to have more understanding of what our circumstances are, because God is God and we're not. And so sometimes I'll feel like he's late, but he's always on time. Verse 8, the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again?" He didn't want them to go to Jerusalem, because they thought they're all going to get strung up, because they were putting out the word, "We're going to kill them." And here's what's interesting. Jesus said this in verse 9. Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Listen to how he said that, though. It's not, he didn't say the light was not with him. He said the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. They're still not getting it. But the reason he was talking about the days that there's there are 12 hours in the day is they were just completing the daytime of the ministry, right there at the Dead Sea. We closed this chapter. Now we're going into the suffering. And this is the night, and you're going to stumble because you don't have my light with you right now. But he's going to later on say, I am the light of the world. But at this moment, they're going to go through this darkness, and they're going to be stumbling around making mistakes. So he's predicting what's about to happen. So he's trying to explain to him, says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he has simply fallen asleep, he will recover. Jesus, with great patience, says, he had spoken of his death, but they thought he just meant he was there, he was resting. So then Jesus finally plainly said, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. And he's saying this to his followers, because his followers were not quite believers. Well, Peter had gotten revelation there, but I talked about this in a previous chapter. There's a difference between doubting and unbelief. Doubting is looking for the solution. It's looking for the answer. Unbelief is resisting the answer. It will fight it even when it gets the truth, because it's embracing their lack of belief. So they were more in a place where they loved what he was saying, but there's a little element of doubt, especially with Thomas, which we'll see in a bit. So doubt plus faith means we'll follow, hoping to become people that can fully believe. So he's saying, for the sake you believe, and those that are there, for you to be able to believe. He said, no, he did die. And I'm glad I wasn't there, because now I'm doing this, what we're about to do, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So then Thomas, even after Jesus just told him, yeah, he died, but we're going to go there, and I'm going to fix this so that you may believe. And Thomas said to the fellow disciples, oh, let's do it. Let us all go, though, so that we may die with him. So it's like, it's a ton of doubt there, but hey, at least we'll die together. So that's what I mean. I'm doubting all of this, but I do love you. I do follow you. They weren't like totally understanding everything he's telling them, but I love the devotion. He's willing to die for him, even though he wasn't buying it all. It's kind of fascinating, because that's what he did. He was kind of the Eeyore of the bunch, right? That Jesus was doing all this so that he may believe. You know, we talk about something in personal development called the RAS, reticular activation system. And that is, all this bytes of information are thrown at you at any given second, but your brain can only process 134 bits at a time. So there's a filter in your mind that filters out all the noise so you can focus on the 134 bits. But what defines that RAS is your belief. And so they didn't have that belief yet, so they weren't seeing everything that Jesus was saying. They're only grasping a little bit of it, pieces of it. Now, in verse 17, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, but yeah, 1.5 miles, 2 miles. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, and she said this and was upset, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She's angry. Her words reek with disappointment, but she still has faith. She just doesn't understand. It's limited. You could have fixed this then, but you're not going to be able to fix it now. It's been 4 days. And that myth I talked about, where they believe that the spirit will linger for a little bit, but after 3 days, there's no way you're going to get this. I mean, some of these people really believe that stuff. And so that's one of the reasons I think this is one of the most incredible miracles he did, is it just flies in the face of everything. That body was already decomposing because they don't embalm, right? But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, so this is where her faith rises up, God will give you. And then Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And I know the power of that. I talked about Luis. I also had a friend of mine. His name was Rick Travnicek. He was a dentist and he was in my church. And I was actually at dinner with them when he was playing his trumpet. He was on the worship team with me. And after he's playing his trumpet, all of a sudden he couldn't talk. And he didn't understand why. We took him to the hospital that night, found out he had a brain tumor. And anyway, they were trying to shrink the tumor a few weeks later, and they had to put him into a drug-induced coma that was supposed to last 2 weeks, only lasted 4 days. And then he woke up screaming. And the reason he woke up screaming was he had been at the throne of God for what felt like 2 years. And he was just in bliss. And so he woke up back in the hospital and saw all of us, and he screamed. It's like, well, that doesn't hurt my feelings. He goes, no, I don't want to see Bill. I was hanging out with Jesus. What am I doing here? And it was really profound, because it really was raw. And he was able to share with us some incredible stuff. But a few weeks later, before he did pass away, his memory of those things was starting to fade. But it was one of the most impactful times of my life with what he shared when he came out of that. It was incredible. And so that Jesus telling her, your brother's going to rise again. So Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day, which was a different doctrine of the day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. So it's really cool. What we're about to see here is what all of us who have faith in Christ are going to experience. Resurrected life in glorified bodies, physically. And so he said, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now resurrection is no longer an event like she was looking at, but now resurrection is a person. He is the resurrection and the life. Wherever Jesus is, he brings life. And then here's an interesting thing that comes next. In verse 28, when she had said this, let's see here. I didn't scroll down. Sorry about that. Let me scroll up here. There we go. When Jesus had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly to go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's interesting here. When you look at some of the words that are used, they are different than when Martha said it. Martha said it with some anger. Here it was just said with sorrow. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come with her were also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And then he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And it says here in verse 35, Jesus wept. But here's what's interesting. It's two different words for wept. Mary's weeping was a loud wail. And the tradition at that time was when you're grieving, it's very demonstrative. The word in the original language is kleio. It meant to shout, to wail in grief. But what's interesting is the word that Jesus used when it said Jesus was weeping, the word meant silently weeping. And part of the question you start asking about this is, why would it be different? And I personally believe, this is just my having studied it, my personal belief is he wasn't weeping about Lazarus dying because he knew what was about to happen. He's not going, oh no, my best friend's dead. He's going, wait a minute, I'm about ready to raise him from the dead. It's not a big deal. I know what I'm going to do. No worries. So what was he weeping? He was moved to tears because these people he's loved, Mary and Martha, are weeping. And it says in Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. So he was feeling the humanity of the moment. He was weeping because he was aligned and resonating with their grief. And so he silently wept. He didn't wail. He silently wept. Well, like I told you, there's this crazy Jewish tradition at that time that the spirit hovers over the body for 3 days. So then on the 4th day, they're gone and they cannot come back, which is why I think it's irreversible. That's why I think he waited, so that he could destroy all of their myths and traditions, let alone the scriptures, the Torah. Not the Torah, actually, the Talmud. But this would make this resurrection that much more profound. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man? Also have kept this man from dying? Well, of course he could have, but it's a matter of being in agreement with what God's plan is. We tend to interpret the love of God through our circumstances, like I said before, rather than interpreting our circumstances through the love of God. And so everybody's confused because he could have fixed this, but he chose not to because there was greater glory that was going to take place. So then in verse 38, Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in this, but I've been in the Garden Tomb, which was one possible place where the actual tomb was. And so I've been inside the burial cave that they had back then. And what you'd see is you'd have little ledges all throughout this thing, like up to 8 different ledges where you could lay bodies on these ledges. So they'd wrap it in spices and then with cloth strippings. And because they wouldn't embalm, that body, not to get gross, but that body would decompose quickly. And all that would be left about a year later would be the bones. And because they would be decomposing almost immediately. And it smells. There was a time when I was in college that we were redoing a kitchen in this fraternity I lived in college, and the electrician shut the power off to the freezers in the kitchen, and we had sides of porpoise and fish inside there, and you open the door and you couldn't even talk. It was just so bad. And that smell is pretty nasty. So the bodies would decompose. And so you didn't want to open up a tomb that was that fresh because it was going to smell. But what they do about a year later is they'd go in there and the bones would be left, and they would then bring out what they called an ossuary, which was a box for the bones and the skull. And so they would then put all the bones together, put in the box, put the skull in there, and close the box. Now you had a bunch more room for other people in the family to die, for like a family tomb. And he was in, he was in a family tomb, is where he was at. And then it would be sealed with about a 3-ton stone, and there would be like a ramp so that the stone would roll down into covering up the opening of the tomb, and then sealed. It would take several people to roll it back up the ramp to open it. So it was not an easy task. It took tools and several people to roll it up. So it was not designed to be opened that easily. But Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that you may believe that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So why did Jesus pray out loud? So God could hear him? He said it very clearly, so that the people could hear him. Later on, when Jesus rises from the dead in John 20, that cloth around his head, it says it was folded neatly. Actually, when you look at that, it wasn't like he was like an OCD guy. What it meant was it was still in the same shape as when it was around his head. So it was like he transmuted through the cloth. But this whole thing, this resurrection, is a preview of what happens to you. For it says in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds and meet the Lord in the air, so that we will always be with the Lord." Remember me talking about the difference between doubt and unbelief? So the disciples were wanting to believe and doubting, especially Thomas. But then you have those with unbelief. So here's what's fascinating to me is the Jews, and let me speak very clearly. What it says here, it's not that the Jews rejected Jesus. The people who rejected Jesus were people of authority that were threatened and territorial about their position in the community, and they saw him as a threat, that he was threatening their way of life. It wasn't the fact that they were Jewish, it was the fact that they were control freaks. So whenever people said the Jews killed Jesus, no, he didn't. The same people I see in the church today that are control freaks would have done the same thing that these Jewish leaders did. It was all about, do I have positional authority or spiritual authority? Is my authority only given to me by men or people in my community, or is this an authority I operate because it's been given to me from God? And they had stuff from men, and they were seeing on display the authority that comes from God, and it threatened them. Because many of the Jews who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, they believed. But then some of them, this is what blows my mind. So some of them were doubters, and now that they saw what Jesus did in raising Lazarus from the dead, they now believed. But then there was another group who saw the same miracle. And they went to the Pharisees to tell them what Jesus had done. That was unbelief. That was in doubt. They don't want to believe. And whenever they got evidence to believe, it's seen as a threat instead of as a gift. And I think that's a really important thing in doubting and unbelief. They're not the same thing. Some people will never believe no matter what. I remember a friend of mine, he actually was working with this guy in Mexico. His son was raised from the dead. And he saw a girl raised from the dead. She was covered in lime and everything, and had been dead for like 2 days. And then she sat up, spit it out. They washed her in the river. And he's watching all this happen. And the entire time it's happening, he's going, this isn't real. This can't be real, because it's just so counter what we're used to. It messes with our mind. But that would be more doubt. But these people, they didn't say, I can't believe what I'm seeing. They saw it and they reported it as bad news to the Pharisees. This guy just raised the dead. We got to stop him. That was their response to the miracle. That's a scary place to be. It should have said all believed when they saw this. That's the difference between doubt and unbelief. Doubt is satisfied when the opportunity to believe is given to you. Unbelief remains unbelieving because you're dedicated out of the hardness of your heart. So they went to the Pharisees. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? So they heard that he raised Lazarus from the dead. What they're doing is planning on how to stop it instead of bow. Scary place to be. For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. That's exactly what it's saying. But here's another reality, because, and we're going to see this. I'm going to stop now, and we'll continue on here, because here's where a dichotomy comes into play. Is a lot of the tension point you see during the Passover is because there were things in history already. There was one time when there was a Jewish man who just refused to obey the centurions, and he would mock the Roman centurion, and it created a violent bloodbath, and then violence broke out. And so there's a decree from Caesar to whoever's the Pontius Pilate of the time, the procurator. He said, during the festivals, because the Passover was a festival that could be very tumultuous, he says, your job is to keep the peace. If you can't keep the peace, I am going to remove you and kill you. So he needed to keep the peace in Jerusalem. And these leaders were seeing the same thing, is if we try to come against him, the people are going to rally around him. If this keeps going, we got to stop this before it gets bigger, because we're going to lose our position, because all we have is positional authority. He has spiritual authority. And it's a threat to our way of life, but also a threat to our peace. Because what they wanted the Messiah to be was kind of as the image of Jacob Maccabeus, who was in the Maccabean revolt many years earlier, which is what started Hanukkah, when they removed Antiochus Epiphanes from the temple, and they had to cleanse the temple, and that's the 8 lights from Hanukkah was all done there. And so they were looking for a military ruler to rise up. So they were looking for the Messiah to be somebody to overthrow Rome. That's what they were looking for. Jesus came to bring peace, like I just read in Ephesians 2. But they were looking for a military guide. And then now the chief priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees are freaking out, because they see that, no, this isn't a military ruler. This guy is doing the miracles of God. We got to stop him, because we're gonna lose everything we have. What's interesting about this, the chief priests is the phrase used for the Sadducees. Sadducees were actually kind of secular. They really weren't big believers. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe any of that stuff. They didn't really believe much. They were just in a political position. Pharisees were much more the religious, conservative believers. But they were really hated each other. Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other, but they hated Jesus more, because what Jesus was doing was going to remove them from their roles, because he was operating in spiritual authority. So what I'm going to do is we're going to stop there, and we're going to go continue on it next time. But I'd love to kind of get your feedback or any questions from what I read. I dug into it a little bit, so to show you some of the things that you would normally see. So Jonathan, I see you have your hand up. Jonathan, what question do you have, my friend? Can't hear you, Jonathan.
Sorry about that.
You're right. Go ahead.
So you brought up that example with the trumpet player, and he passed away.
Yeah.
Crazy brain tumor. I've been asked recently by people, how does God do things like that? And my answer has just been, I know what works, and I know how I feel when I'm in connection. I don't understand what doesn't work.
Yeah.
What is your answer?
My answer is God's God and I'm not. There's a lot of things I can see, but there's times when I thought God was going to do some amazing miracles and it didn't come to pass the way I expected. There's other times I wasn't expecting to do anything and he just blew my mind. I had one person, he was a gentleman who was an electrician, and he blew all of his fingers off of his hands. I mean, they're gone, and he was dead. And they shocked him back to life, so he's dead just momentarily. But he had broken bones because he fell from a high tension power line, and but he blew off all of his fingers. And I'm sitting next to this guy later on, not while it happened. He had all his fingers. They were just miraculously brought back. I could go on the whole story, but yeah, he was miraculously healed. He should have been dead, and if he did live, he should have been crippled. And there's just small signs of where the fractures healed, but he was healed instantly, and he didn't have any fingers. I had photographs to prove it. No fingers, and dear friends that were with him, he had no fingers left, and now he had fingers.
Wow.
And so I've seen those kind of miracles too. But there's other times that I thought God would do great things and he didn't. But then later on, like in my case, he did greater things on my behalf than I was expecting. And so I looked like he didn't answer my prayer, but it's because he answered a bigger prayer in order to get me out of that situation.
Like my example specifically was, somebody called me in a panic a few evenings ago, and they're like, this mom that I know just died giving birth to her second child. How does your God do that?
Ask that again.
So they work at a hospital. Their
Yep.
friend had just given birth to their second child, died in the hospital giving birth, leaving the first child with the dad. And they're on the fence about God and church and religion. And
Sure.
They said, how does your God do things like that?
Oh, okay. I heard it correctly this time. God doesn't do that. And now this is the answer people this is the answer people won't like, but I believe this. We did that, not God. And when I mean we, I mean humankind. And what I mean by that is, in the garden, everything was perfect. He created everything good. There was no bad weather. The garden was lush, beautiful. You could eat off the tree. We just weren't supposed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We could eat of the tree of life, and you didn't read of everything else. He created us good. No hurricanes, no storms, no disease, nothing. And then we decided we want to become like gods and follow the serpent's deception. And then we had to be kicked out of Eden. And now we have to farm, and we got to plant seeds. So farming is evidence of the curse, that we now live in this world. And then after the judgment of Noah and the flood and all that, where the atmosphere changed, now we have hurricanes, we have storms, we have disease. None of that is what God created. All that came from the perversion of us saying we want to be like God. So that's, and people go, well, then why would God allow that? Well, it's very simple. Every single one of us want to be loved, right? You know where we got that desire to have a spouse or somebody that we're one with? We had that desire because that's God's desire. And he wanted somebody to be a lover of his soul. He wanted us to fall in love with him. He's the bridegroom, I'm the bride. But do you want to find your spouse as some kind of a robot you can buy at Target? Yeah, push a button and it has to, by command, love you? No. I want somebody who chooses to love me. In order to give them a choice, you've got to give them two options. And they chose the wrong one.
That's so good. Thank you, Bill.
Is that helpful?
Oh, that was tremendously helpful. Thank
Good.
you.
Any other questions or comments, everybody? Yes, Garcia.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is John 11:8-10,
Yeah.
where disciples asked him, why is he going back to where he could be stoned? And he gives the response about 12 hours in the day and walking in the light. I am not connecting that question and the response. I'm not getting it.
Okay. So he knew this is right before Passover. Okay. Scripturally, I would have to say, honestly, somewhere between January and April. But I think it's more like almost to April, because I think the Passover was about to take place. Everything was getting heated. So what Jesus was saying, the 12 hours of the day when there's light, you can see where you're walking because the light is in the world, right? The sun is shining down. I can see everything. I can walk around. I can avoid stumbling over this rock or whatever else. He said, but there's going to come a time now in the night, the 12 hours of night, where you can't see and you're going to stumble. So what he's predicting is Peter betraying him, other disciples scattering because when he was arrested, taken to court, which was all at night, though most of this was a metaphor, it was, you're not going to see in the light of being with me because I've been arrested. You're going to be stumbling in the dark. I'm going to be going through the suffering of this persecution, of being in the court and being flogged and all that. And so they're scattered and they're scared to death and they can't see. And so they're not steady. They're stumbling around because his light is dimmed for that moment while he's being persecuted. So he's predicting his suffering. So the 12 hours of darkness is his suffering, his passion, his flogging, putting a crown of thorns on his head, and his crucifixion. Does that make sense?
It helps. I'm going to have to sit on it for a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. That's the best thing about it is keep digging. That's what I always ask people. I said, man, if that doesn't land that well for you, keep digging and figure out why, because that's where we get revelation, is ask those questions. So yeah, absolutely, Garcia, keep digging.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I've got a question.
Go for it, Donovan.
For discernment across spiritual authority and positional authority.
Yeah.
You mentioned Pharisees and what was the other side?
Sadducees. Yeah.
Sadducees. I can definitely understand the points being put there, ego playing a big part of it, right? But when you're building on like a movement, and we had a similar discussion about this when we prayed for Ryan and with Altar Call.
Yeah.
Like when you see yourself being put in positions of let's say higher levels of leadership, and what comes to mind is remember that movie that came, was it Jesus Revolution?
Yeah.
What comes to mind is when I start seeing people that are being put in in high places of leadership, and there's a turning point when it's either a choice where God's put me here, or by my own, power God has put, or by my own might and people that God have put me here. So in terms of like spiritual authority and positional authority, is it spiritual more of just being connected and rooted to the fact that there that God is the only reason why you're doing what you're doing, and that maybe through him or through let's say the vessel that he's put you in, that you've been able to step up into that, versus positional authority being, I mean, maybe the belief that God has put you in that, but you've just elevated the opportunity. I'm just trying to, just really
No,
decipher.
that's so great, man. That's a great question. It's really deep on several fronts, because you got what John Maxwell teaches, and that is that leadership it's a law of leadership, because he believes everybody can be a leader, which I agree with him on that. Leadership is different than authority. But I can learn how to lead people, right? But positional authority is when there's people that I know that depend on their position. That's where they get their identity. And this is what I usually say is, you got, also love the Lord thy God with thy heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are 2 commandments. If you don't really know who you are in Christ, you're gonna have difficulty having healthy relationships, because you're needing something from those relationships that you should only be getting from God. But when you really know who you are in Christ, then I can enjoy relationships, because I don't need anything from them. I get some things from them, they're blessings, but they're not needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that same way, is if I'm needing people to recognize me as a spiritual authority figure, then I'm demonstrating that I don't have spiritual authority. And really what spiritual authority is complete surrender. And if there's a lesson I taught a few months ago about impacting your business with spiritual authority, and what it comes down to is, when you discover who God is and what you're not, when you see the gap, is then you can completely surrender and say, you're the boss, you do what you need me to do, and then I need to be obedient to it. If you're being obedient to the intimate messages you're getting from God as he's directing you, that, and only then are you able to walk in spiritual authority. Because Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing, is why he was able to be a purely unadulterated spiritual authority. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's we sometimes
like the authority never, just being in a spiritual authority is almost never claiming that you're in spiritual authority. Got it.
Yeah.
It's never self-proclaimed. Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah. It's, when we step into leadership, we learn and we grow and become better leaders. But at certain points, we come into authority that could be inherently the authority we were given to walk in. But to get into spiritual authority is a whole nother beast. And that means complete and utter surrender, where I submit fully to Christ in every step I do. And that's a high call.
So then, I guess follow-up question, unless anyone else has anything real quick.
No, go for it. Go for it.
On that, do you ever know when you're in spiritual authority?
I think you can have a good feel that you're in spiritual authority, because you are completely submitting to him. But most of the time when I've looked back, when I looked back, I saw that it was spiritual authority more than knowing it as it was happening. Like the example I gave in a business, I'll give one that's not in a business situation. If you listen to my lesson, I gave one when I was trying to get into this ad agency, and I did exact opposite of what I'm told to do, because God told me to do this different thing, and it worked out beautifully. But there was another time when I was praying for this person, and I had to step out of my comfort zone, because God was telling me things to do to pray for this person, and I felt like a complete idiot doing it because I'm kind of a conservative. I'm not a flamboyant dude, but I had to do some flamboyant stuff when I was praying for it because that's what he was showing me to do. And then later on, found out she had a really bad case of scoliosis, and it was crippling. And the flamboyancy was really speaking to her. It was because she wanted to be a dancer and never could. And it was like I was expressing things that she was supposed to express. And they come to my office a few days later with the x-rays from the doctor, and her back was completely straight. She was going to start dancing classes. And I went, I think that was spiritual authority. But I didn't know that at the time. But it's just amazing. But all you need to look at on your side is, am I completely surrendering myself, submitting myself to Christ? That's our job. It's not, am I in spiritual authority, but it is, am I submitted to him completely? That's a scary thing, because that means I got to trust something I don't understand. And we're always afraid of the unfamiliar. Is that helpful?
I'm definitely gonna dive in deeper on the differences between authority and leadership, but I appreciate that. That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions before we close? Yes, sir.
Hey, Bill.
You're so far away. Is that Kenny?
Yeah.
All right, man. Let me have it.
So you had the three. I forgot the middle one. You said phileo was friendship, agape was conditional love, and then the one that was for central. What was that one?
Eros. Like erotica.
And what's like central? What is that? Is that more like the internal side of the love, or
what? Eros?
Yeah.
Sex.
Oh, I see.
I'll spell it out. It's sexual, friendship, and unconditional, unrequited love. Meaning, you can never stop it. It's what he poured out, not because anybody's going to do anything for him, but it's unconditional. That's agape.
Okay. And then my second part of the question is, because Donovan, he pretty much tapped in for the most of everything that I was pretty much going to ask. So
yeah,
my part from the spiritual authority side, which I love how you explain it from the chief priests, right? So if they already knew that Jesus was doing God's miracles in a sense, and there were these signs, even how you were saying, if it was a threat to their position of authority, if they were still undeniably seeing signs that were clearly miracles, like, wouldn't that be a sign for them to kind of step out of their own ego and to basically say, if this is something that's, coming from God, even from a place that's not where we expect it, shouldn't have that been their moment to basically practice their, practice what they preach and kind of submit? Like,
I would think so, but not. Yeah,
I'm just trying to
think. Well, this is the difference between doubt and unbelief. Just like with Pharaoh in Egypt. I mean, Moses told him what were the plagues that were coming, and they happened. And all that would happen from that, he would freak out, but then he would harden his heart. Why? Because he knew it was ego. He's the head honcho in Egypt. And if I submit to this God, that means I'm no longer head honcho. And so for self-worship's sake, Pharaoh refused it and caused decimation in his nation. In the same way, well, in fact, I'm going to go here just because you're bringing this up. So I'm going to go back to John. Let me pull it up here real quick. There's the passage that I had on here that is actually a prophecy, and it was Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. He said to them, this is in verse 49. You can just go right down to it there in John 11. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest for that year, God used him because he was anointed high priest. He prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So where he was saying it from a perspective of, isn't it better that we kill this one guy so we don't lose our positions? It's kind of what that was his perspective. But what he said was, isn't it better that one man die for the nation? And so he actually prophesied what Jesus was going to do and why he was doing it. He didn't understand what he was saying, but he actually prophesied what Jesus was about to do.
And then I guess that would kind of tie into like that spiritual authority, because it's that surrender, right? Like you're not, like you just said, he didn't really know what it was that he was saying, but it's somehow later connected.
Right. Well, doubt and unbelief. Doubt is looking for an answer. Unbelief isn't looking for an answer. Unbelief is saying, I am not wanting this at all. So even whatever I see, haven't you ever met anybody that you bring facts to them and it just makes them madder? Like I did back when I first came to the Lord, I set up a debate with the dean of the physics department in the University of Iowa with an expert biochemist out of El Cajon, California. I'm 23 years old. I'm flying this guy on my own dime, and I don't make any money. I was making $14,000 a year. And I paid for it all myself, put him up in a hotel, did this debate. We won the debate. And you know what happened when we won the debate? It was at the big Memorial Union down in downtown Iowa City, University of Iowa. We had a riot. And so my bouncer skills came in handy because I had to kind of protect this guy and get him out of the building because they were throwing bottles and everything. They got mad when they saw the truth because it wasn't what they wanted to believe. And so as miraculous as the resurrection of Lazarus was, it just made them mad because it meant we got to kill this guy because he's going to ruin our livelihood. That's how hard their hearts were. It's really the same deception that kept Pharaoh's heart. You know, they just wanted to keep their position. Pharaoh wanted to keep his position.
Wow.
Yeah, scary stuff. So, all right. Well, I look forward to continuing this conversation on the next one. And bless you all. Have a great night.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill.